The intellectual property theft, which China has taken from the United States, is significant. There are no rules of the road. There's no penalty to be paid. Why not take it if it's free of charge? They're actually taking a serious stab at dealing with the pollution problem. It now has become not just an environmental catastrophe for them, but a political issue. The day and age of when everything was contained and not made public are over. We don't have a capacity as the United States government to deal with this onslaught of new investment coming into the United States. There's not an easy solution when it comes to sovereignty, and there's no easy solution to the issue called the South China Sea. That's going to be a hugely consequential issue between the United States and China. Now, the Chinese, I like to say, play the long game, and we play the short game. And therein lies one of the challenges when you're negotiating any kind of agreement with China. They want to know what we're going to be doing in 20 years, and we want to know what they're going to be doing next month.
Global Leadership, Our Future with China and Hendrickson Forum 2016 is a Minnesota Partnership co-production of the Hendrickson Institute of Ethical Leadership and the Undertold Stories Project of St. Mary's University of Minnesota and Twin Cities PBS. Major funding has been provided by U.S. Bank and 3M.
Good morning and welcome to our 9th annual Hendrickson Forum. My name is Brother Robert Smith. I'm the Chief Academic Officer of the University and the Vice President of our Schools of Graduate and Professional Programs. And it is a pleasure and an honor to have so many distinguished guests with us today. A decade ago, we established the Hendrickson Forum as a venue for our greater community to examine the principles of ethical leadership, to investigate and discuss a current issue that can only be resolved through the practice of ethical leadership, and to celebrate, honor, and recognize the practice of ethical leadership. Over the past 9 forums, we have addressed such issues as the reaction of the government and businesses to the Great Recession, and how we can move forward in a way that builds our economy while also providing greater protections for our communities. We have deliberated on what it takes to protect ourselves from the growing threat of cyber terrorism and the appropriate roles of the public and private sectors acting independently as well as collaboratively. Today we will come together to think about how we move forward with a global partner who has the largest population in the world, who is the 2nd largest economy globally, and who has a rapidly growing middle class, but a partner who, with all of the opportunities that exist, still has significant issues for us to be concerned about, including business practices, security issues, and human rights concerns.
We are excited to be joined today by one of the nation's premier experts on China. Governor Jon Huntsman began his public service career as a staff assistant to President Ronald Reagan. He held numerous posts during both Presidents George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr.'s administrations, including Ambassador to Singapore, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce of Asia, and U.S. Trade Ambassador. From 2005 to 2009, he served as the governor of Utah. In May of 2009, President Barack Obama asked Governor Huntsman to serve his country once again, this time as a U.S. ambassador to China. In his announcement of the appointment, President Obama stated, "I can think of no more important assignment than creating the kinds of bridges between our two countries that will determine the well-being not just of Americans and Chinese, but also the future of the world." Since leaving his ambassadorship in 2011, Governor Huntsman has continued his leadership role in many of these critical issues. He serves as the co-chair of the Intellectual Property Commission, where he is at the forefront of defining what policies will mitigate ongoing and future damage and obtain greater enforcement of intellectual property rights by China and other infringers. He serves as the chairman of the Atlantic Council and co-chair of the Asia Economic Strategy Commission. Following Governor Huntsman's remarks, he will be joined on stage by Mr. Dale Kirshner, Editor-in-Chief of Twin Cities Business, who will moderate the question and answer portion of our program. And now, St. Mary's University of Minnesota and the Hendrickson Institute of Ethical Leadership are honored to welcome Governor Jon Huntsman to the 2016 Hendrickson Forum.
Thank you, Scott, for that generous and totally undeserved introduction. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Scott, for the intro and conveniently leaving out a couple of things in my background. One, I'm a failed rock and roll musician and left a band a long time ago, but that was my aspiration in life, to be a world-renowned keyboard player. Didn't work out as planned. So what do you do as a failed rock musician? Well, you go into politics, right? That's kind of the natural fallback position. And thanks for conveniently omitting the other part that, yeah, I ran for president at one point in my career. I got booted off the stage a little bit later than the guy who was governor of this state at the time, who was running the same cycle about 4 years ago. But for those of you who haven't run for president before out there, it's exhausting, it's intimidating, it's exhilarating, and it's sometimes humiliating. We won't get into any more beyond that. But let me say we were doing just great until a well-known liberal came out, a guy named Michael Moore, and said, that Huntsman guy, he's actually a Republican I could support one of these days. Iowa, right down the drain. And that was followed up by a great endorsement by a newspaper called the Boston Globe. Well, that didn't do so well in the Republican primaries. And then Bill Clinton came out and said, yeah, that Huntsman guy, he seems pretty unhidebound. He's actually a Republican I could support one of these days. Game over. Game over in those early primary states. But we're better having done it. Let me put it that way. I've got a couple of things that I want to talk to you about as it relates to China. And I was described as a China expert. Let me just tell you that in my 35 years in the China business, having lived overseas 4 times, having studied it thoroughly as a diplomat in business, as a trade negotiator, there are no experts out there. There are specialists, there are no experts. It's too complex a subject matter, and I hope to open up a couple of doors in my few moments with you today to maybe put in perspective one of the more complicated relationships the world has ever seen, yet one that will be perhaps the most consequential of the 21st century. Let me begin by saying that I think the world and this country is at an inflection point. That's a very important one. And I can talk about these things because I ain't running for office. I'm not asking for anyone's vote. So let me just be brutally honest with you about where I think we sit. I think we sit today, 2016, not unlike other inflection points we've seen in world history. Not unlike 1919, where the world got together after World War I and the Treaty of Versailles and put together a construct that didn't serve the world well. It broke down. It evolved into political extremes, another world war, a depression. And then we hit another inflection point long about 1945, the end of World War II. And the world came together yet again to create a template for growth and prosperity and security. And I would argue that the decisions made in 1945 served the world reasonably well. Not without its faults and its upheaval from time to time in additional wars, although I would say that the first half of the 20th century saw 180 million people killed. The second half of the century saw only 20 million killed, so I guess by that measure we're making progress in a sense. But inflection points matter because decisions are made during those moments that will then carry on for the next 25 to 50 years. And if those decisions are bad, you have to live those consequences for a very long time. And I'm pointing to 2 examples in the last 100 years where we had bad decisions made, 1919, threw the world into chaos and turmoil, and better decisions in 1945, which resulted in greater stability, growth, trade, opening up, movement of people. And then we reached another inflection point at about 1989 with the fall of communism in the Soviet Union and the United States wondering what to do with its newfound status as the only remaining superpower in the world. Well, I think we squandered some moments. We didn't do much at all. We didn't use our leverage. And then we were hit on 9/11. It sent us reeling, and I would argue that we are still recovering from a foreign policy standpoint from decisions made in the aftermath of that. And then we were hit again in an economic context with the collapse of Lehman Brothers, 2007, early 2000. I was governor during that time. And I remember well what it was like being a governor pre-Lehman collapse and what it was like being a governor post-Lehman collapse. If you want to know when my party, which I think is coming to a cyclical endpoint, you know, all things go in cycles, commodity cycles, real estate cycles. I think we're in a political cycle that's cycling through the old phase and we'll begin a new phase at some point. What that new phase looks like, I don't know, but it kind of feels like it'll be populist of sorts, a little more nationalistic. But there was such a difference serving as governor pre-Lehman and post-Lehman, and my party changed dramatically, pre-Lehman versus post-Lehman, and maybe we can get into that another time. But I would submit to you that we're at an inflection point right now, not unlike 1919, 1945, 1989, and the decisions that are going to be made are going to be highly consequential for this country and, by extension, the world. And it upsets me enormously that we're having shallow conversations about the issues that really matter. We're reducing things to sound bites. We're reducing things to humor and to entertainment, where we need to be elucidated with ideas, have a national discussion about strategy, about the long term, and what options we have realistically to sustain us as people going forward. And we're not getting that yet. Maybe we will at some point. But here are the drivers of change that exist today on the global stage that didn't exist a few short years ago. One, we're seeing a huge diffusion of power in the world, where non-state actors can rise up and drive an agenda, giving rise to transnational crimes, terrorism, cyber. ISIS is a perfect example of this. Our problem, our national security thinking and infrastructure was hardwired in 1947 with the National Security Act of 1947, and we still think in those terms. And we haven't done a very good job in updating and refreshing our ability to deal with the world where there's been an enormous diffusion of power. We're not fighting nations, folks. We're fighting movements, bands, and tribes of people. Number two, we're seeing individual empowerment like never before. Anyone can call for a revolution on Twitter and people turn out. We're seeing the rise of the global middle class like never before. 3.5 billion people who have entered the workforce. The real economy since 1989. Number three, we're seeing the erosion of the old order. The Treaty of Westphalia circa 1648. The Treaty of Versailles, the concept of coexisting nations based on a balance of power. Putin is an example of this phenomenon, responding to past grievances, restoring pride in populations that have faltered. And finally, we're seeing a remarkable demographic shift, the trends and patterns associated with movement of people. We're aging as a world. Europe, Japan, going from 120 million people to 90 million people without replenishing its population. Migration. Look at the front pages of the newspapers. Urbanization. My ancestors all grew up in a little town called Fillmore, Utah, smack dab in the middle of the sea. So named for the president, Millard Fillmore. Remember Millard Fillmore? Utah so desperately wanted to get statehood that it named a city, population 2,000, all of them were Huntsmans then, after Millard Fillmore. So they named the county Millard and the city Fillmore. And they still didn't get statehood. It didn't work. They had a little problem called polygamy. But all those Huntsman relatives and ancestors, they're not in Fillmore anymore. They've all gone to the big cities. And what we have seen in the last half decade is movement from rural populations to more of the urban settings. But the world I submit to you, will be most impacted by the events of two nations, the United States and China. And when the headlines are written at the end of this century, we won't be around to see them. I suspect they're going to read about the most significant stories of the century being advancements in health sciences, biotechnology, the extension of human life, the conquering of human disease, because that's what we've been able to do the last 100 years without our fully recognizing it in profound ways. And I think that's only going to be expedited. That's going to be a huge story. And the jobs you create in this part of the United States and the association you have with the work around the end of the Human Genome Project is going to sustain you probably like nothing else. And I suspect another major story is going to be the rise of the Muslim world and the impact that they had on the 21st century, story yet to be written. And I think the most significant story will be not government shutdowns, because they've happened and they will happen again. I suspect the biggest story will be the rise of China, and whether that happened in a peaceful context or whether that brought people toward war and bloodshed and turmoil. And that's a story that has yet to be written. So let me just leave you with 8 quick points. Not that I'm going to quiz you on them later, but because 8 is an auspicious number in China. And in determining what I would leave you with, it had to, of course, deal with the number 8, because if you want a license plate that is the best of all in a Chinese city, you get one with straight 8s. It'll cost you a couple $1 million in Hong Kong, but it is an auspicious number. Point number 1 is the 5th generation in China has now taken over and solidified its power. Now, what do I mean by the 5th generation of power? We've been through Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and now we have a guy named Xi Jinping, XI. Get to know him because he's going to be around for a while. Now, Xi Jinping in June will turn 63 years of age. He's the son of Xi Jinping, who was a deputy prime minister under Mao Zedong, sent to prison because of his reform-minded tendencies. Xi, who runs the country himself, was exiled during the Cultural Revolution out to Shanxi, which is a little bit like Wyoming. Not Utah, but a little bit like Wyoming. You're sent out to the countryside for hard labor. And now his generation, and I've dealt now for 35 years over at least 3 of these 5 generations. Gone are the Mao jackets. In are the suits and ties, the impeccable English, the degrees from the finest institutions in the world, and a very nuanced and sophisticated reading of the United States. Doesn't matter whose office I would visit when I was U.S. ambassador in China, Minister of Finance, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Health. They could tell me what was happening in my country with the sophisticated level of understanding. I try to find a corollary in my own government. I can't find it. I can't find people who speak the language, who have traveled to what will be our most important relationship of the 21st century, or who can tell me anything about what's happening in this country of 1.4 billion people. And we will be diminished because our lack of human capacity to deal with the challenges that will be thrown at us. Now, where are all the folks going who know something about the subject? They're going to corporate America. That's where the talent is going. They're not going in as they did at one time to serve the country. I wish they were. The 5th generation is solidly in power. Make no mistake about it. Xi Jinping, through an anti-corruption campaign that is now about 2 years old, has done a job in consolidating his power base. Now, what does it mean to consolidate your power base in China? The 3 titles that matter most for the leader of China, and she has all of them, are president, which means nothing, head of the Communist Party, which means everything. Well, what is a Communist Party today? 80 million people scattered in 3,500 outposts across the country. It is the only organization that moves things. And if you want to get any place in business or in politics in China, you become a party member at a young age and you move up through the ranks. And third, the military operation, which Xi Jinping is now chair of, the CMC, the Central Military Commission. So Xi today has all three positions of power that he will continue to hold until he exits the stage after his second term in 2022. Point number two, what are the goals of China these days? What does Xi Jinping and the fifth generation wake up to every day? They have three things on their minds. One, domestic stability. Because if they can't hold 1.4 people together, if there is tearing at the periphery of this country, all bets are off. And what keeps people together? What provides for domestic stability? Which is goal number two, economic growth. If unemployment gets beyond a certain level, as it did along with key economic indicators in spring of 1989, it leads to revolt and public uprisings like we saw with Tiananmen Square. Economic growth and leadership's ability to focus laser-like on creating jobs is a huge challenge for them and a priority. And number three, preserving the party. Because there is no alternative governing structure in China. You have a party. It's not like if the party fails, you've got somebody backing them up who can all of a sudden take over the reins of power. It doesn't exist. The system collapses, which would be a catastrophe for the broader East Asia region. Number three, China has just gone through an interesting exercise this last month in unveiling their 13th five-year plan. Now, the Chinese, I like to say, play the long game, and we play the short game. And therein lies one of the challenges when you're negotiating any kind of agreement with China. They want to know what we're going to be doing in 20 years, and we want to know what they're going to be doing next month. There's this concept of China being the best long-term strategic thinkers in the world, negotiating with some of the best short-term tactical thinkers in the world, Americans, and finding this huge chasm in the middle. And bridging that gap always remains the challenge. The 13th five-year plan, and they've been making these five-year plans from the beginning in 1949, 1950, when the People's Republic took rise. What are they talking about? And what came out just last month of the NPC, the National People's Congress, that is noteworthy? Well, they're talking about rule of law. They're talking about judicial reform, which just doesn't exist, hasn't up to now. Concepts that would have been totally out of the realm of possibility a few short years ago. New rules for the internet, deep sea, and outer space. Higher education, as we sit here at this great institution. They want to create research universities. One of the things they envy most about what we have here in the United States, the ability to take nascent technology, nurture it, mature it, and commercialize it, and create new industries, the new things of tomorrow. They would like desperately to be able to do that kind of thing. In terms of overall society, reforming their pension funds. There's no retirement, so they've got to start doing something about how they're going to care for a rapidly aging population. Raising the retirement age will probably be part of that as well. Healthcare, 26,000 hospitals in China, half of which are public, the other half are private, delivering care, which today is done fairly inefficiently unless you can get to one of the top hospitals in a big city, particularly to the rural areas, is a huge, huge undertaking. Technology, expanding online commerce, increasing speeds, lowering fees, expanding the cyberspace industry, and cleaning up the online environment. Now, you always have to worry about when you hear from China cleaning up the online environment, because that probably means a lot of Western content. What I found so interesting is that they're actually taking a serious stab at dealing with the pollution problem. And for those of you who have been over there, spent any time, you know exactly what I'm talking about. To take your daughter, as I used to do, out and put her on a school bus where you couldn't even see across the street, the air pollution was so bad, it now has become not just an environmental catastrophe for them, but a political issue. People are now taking this up as a political issue on Twitter, on Facebook, even though it's blocked routinely, and calling people out on these issues. We did an interesting thing at the embassy, which is a massive compound in China, now our second largest embassy in the world, about 2,000 professionals who work there. We put a little fancy monitoring device on the roof, along with a lot of other fancy devices. And this was an EPA air quality monitor. And we would get the air quality and we would tweet it out. Then would come the call from the foreign ministry to the ambassador. Come in for a haranguing, my typical weekly haranguing. Your numbers are wrong, they would say. You're calculating them all wrong. Our numbers are correct. Yours are wrong. You're out there by the second or third ring row and you're getting too much of the exhaust pollutants. You have to use our numbers. Well, we kept tweeting it out. More and more people would read it. More and more people would become outraged. I never thought I'd live long enough, but today China has actually embraced EPA standards for reading air quality. It's quite amazing to see what has happened in terms of the turnaround and the political focus now that is on cleaning up the air in China. So those are some of the things that are coming out of the 13th five-year plan. And let me turn now to my fourth point, which are the economic challenges, maybe the most significant part of all. Are there strengths in the Chinese economy? Of course there are. It's a large market. It's a relatively open market. There's a high savings rate, the kind of savings rate we would like to have, 30, 35%. There's great education. 26% of college-age kids are enrolled in some form of college education. High R&D investments, the highest number of filed patents now in the world, the second highest in published scientific papers today in the world. All that's good, and all that is steps in a positive direction. Here are the challenges. So China's disembarking from an old economic growth model, the investment-led export platform, which they've used for 35 years. And who wouldn't fail at this? You draw from cheap labor, you bash and discount your currency, you export to all of the leading purchasing nations of the world, you can't go wrong. And you amass enormous amounts of foreign exchange reserves. Well, those days have come to an end. They're now in the middle income trap, where incomes just aren't rising anymore. They've had no choice but to unplug from the old system and to move toward a new model based on consumption. People purchasing things, people making more domestically, firing up the innovation and entrepreneurial side of their economy, which they've really never been successful at doing before. They're somewhere in the middle of this journey, and there's no guarantee that they're going to get to the promised land. And we see the marketplace that has disruptions here and disruptions there. We saw, as mentioned earlier, last August, the Shenzhen Stock Exchange, one of two, you have Shanghai and Shenzhen, that lost 40% of its value in a couple of days. No surprise there. The forward trading PE multiplier on next year's earnings was 40 times. 40 times. I mean, anyone looking closely at this exchange would have told you that this is bound to collapse at some point. You consider the S&P market, which a lot of people consider to be hot as it is only 20 times forward earnings. So there's no guarantee that the new economic model that they've set out as their goal is going to be achievable. Meanwhile, you've got an aging population, more people leaving the workforce than entering the workforce, and by 2020, the predicted labor shortages are about 23 million workers, if you can get your head around that. Income inequality is vast on the economic side. When you look at the Gini coefficient, with 0 being equality and 1 being inequality, China sits at about a 0.65, not far from when the red flags, no pun intended, begin to go off. To put it in perspective, the wealth disparity among provinces, of which there are 30 in China, the poorest being Guizhou, the wealthiest being Jiangsu, is about 4 times. Compared and contrasted to what we would have here in the United States between Mississippi being our poorest on a per capita income level and Delaware being our wealthiest, which is at about 2 times. Xi Jinping's goal for the country in terms of per capita income is about $12,000 by 2020, and they seem set to be able to achieve that. Number 5. As you move from economic challenges, you find that there are some real social challenges. Air quality, we have mentioned. China has about 700,000 internet users, many of whom are blocked, but as my daughters figured out in about 2.5 minutes, through VPN technology, you can jump the Great Wall that they use to try to block, and you can connect with the outside world. You've got issues of urbanization that are absolutely mind-boggling. So I was there in China with 2 presidents on their first trips to China. And it was interesting to compare and contrast. I went with Ronald Reagan when I was a young staffer in the early 1980s with him. And then I was Air's envoy when President Obama made his first trip to China. And President Obama, in our meeting with then Premier Wen Jiabao, was going on and on about the challenges that we have here in the United States. And Premier Wen stopped him in his tracks and said, well, Mr. President, how would you like to have this as a problem? How would you like to be a nation of 800 million farmers and wake up one day and find out that you only need 200 million farmers? He said, I have 600 million redundant farmers on my hands, and I'm not quite sure what to do with them. You've got urbanization issues. You've got populations moving from the center into the cities, healthcare challenges, transportation challenges, water issues, to say nothing of the air quality that we've already talked about. And it's all being put out in the open increasingly. The day and age of when everything was contained and not made public are over. You had a documentary on pollution that was put out by one enterprising reporter, which drew 200 million viewers online within a day. Shut down, of course, not long thereafter, but you get a sense as to how this can be a tinderbox of sorts. Number 6, it's important to remember that we're entering the so-called political season, both in the United States and in China. China goes in cycles based on party congresses, and they have every 5 years since the death of Mao Zedong in 1976. And they're about to enter into the season that will take us to the 19th Party Congress, which will be sometime fall of next year. Well, these are important seasons because it will be an opportunity for Xi Jinping, who will be re-elected, re-upped. They don't have elections like we do, but reappointed to a second term. Well, he will repopulate the highest level party organizations, like the Standing Committee of the Politburo, which has about 7 people, 5 of whom will be leaving, 5 new people will be coming in, and who those 5 people are and how they view the market and how they view the world will be terribly consequential. The Politburo, which has 25 people, will be repopulated in large part. The Central Committee, around which all revolves, about 370 people there, will be rebuilt as well. So the politics about a year out from a party congress, you will begin to feel, much like our own presidential political cycles, where things become a little nativist, a little shrill. You say things that you might not mean, but you do it for political purposes because you got to capture the wings of the party. Well, the same thing goes on in China. And we're going to start feeling that probably within the next couple of months as they prepare for the 19th Party Congress. Number 7. When you look at the 2 biggest trends ahead on the economic side, and as you mentioned, China is your 3rd largest market as a state, I would say that the investment tsunami that has been talked about, I shouldn't call it a tsunami, that's a Japanese term. In Chinese, they call it a haixiao. Isn't being talked about anymore. It has hit. If you look at the amount of investment that took place here in the United States, last year, 2015, it amounted to about $15 billion. When you look at the pipeline already for 2016, it's $30 to $40 billion. We don't have a capacity at the foreign investment review level as the United States government to deal with this onslaught of new investment coming into the United States. It's coming. It could result in a lot of good. It could result in a lot of complication too. And I suspect a lot of folks at the local government level will be dealing with this influx of investment. But the second feature of what I think is going to be a very interesting future on the economic side will be the export potential that the United States has with a China that is moving away from the old model to a newer consumption model, where you'll have 200 or 300 million people who are part of a new consumer class, people who like American products, people who have more in the way of disposable per capita income to buy American products. So every city, every county, every state in the United States, I suspect, is going to feel an upsurge when it comes to export opportunities to China. We have already. The state of Utah, your state, China was nowhere to be seen on the top 3, top 5 list of export nations. Today they're number 3. In some cases, it's number 1. Those 2 big trends, keep your eyes on them. 8th and finally, let me just talk about a couple of the challenges. I boil it down to cyber, where the intellectual property theft, which China has taken from the United States, is significant. There are no rules of the road. There's no penalty to be paid. Why not take it if it's free of charge? And there we sit without having adequately addressed it. This is going to be a hugely consequential issue going forward because it means jobs, it means innovation, and it impinges on our security. I would say that the second challenge is going to be sovereignty, and that will be what happens with the issue of the South China Sea, where you have these island chains, the Paracel and Spratly Islands, 250 little dots in the South China Sea, little atolls that don't mean much of anything at all unless you own them. And if you own them, you get exclusive economic zone rights that take you out 250, 300 miles. And if you own enough of these islands, pretty much you own the entire sea. And it's therefore no surprise that you've got 5 claimants in the neighborhood, all of whom basically lay claim to some of those islands in dispute between Philippines, Indonesia, Brunei, Malaysia, or Malaysia and Singapore and Vietnam. There is no answer. There is no easy solution. When it comes up in a political context, as always, we'll send in the 7th Fleet. Well, I have 2 sons in the U.S. Navy, and I can tell you I don't want my son sent into something for which there's no thought-out long-term strategy. The answer can't always be just send in the 7th Fleet, because that's not an answer. There's not an easy solution when it comes to sovereignty, and there's no easy solution to the issue called the South China Sea. That's going to be a hugely consequential issue between the United States and China. Third and finally, security. North Korea. It just so happens that the United States and China wake up to the fact that we have a whole lot more in common as it relates to North Korea, where you've got crazy leadership, unhinged leadership, that is perhaps on the cusp of blowing up their 4th nuclear weapon in about 6 years. Well, the Chinese, who used to consider North Korea a strong partner and ally, cheek by jowl, they used to call the closeness of their relationship. No longer the case today. Is it a message loud and clear that Xi Jinping, the leader of China, has met with President Park of South Korea countless times and not once met with the head of North Korea? We have a basketball player from the United States, a guy named Dennis Rodman, who spent far more time in North Korea with the head of North Korea than the Chinese leader. And there's apparently a country that has a very strong alliance. Less and less so, there's more and more distance. And China sees they've got more in the way of commonality with the United States in denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula and bringing about security there, notwithstanding our 30,000 troops in South Korea. So keep your eye on that. It's going to be an interesting election cycle, particularly as it relates to international security, foreign affairs, and the U.S.-China relationship. Let me just end for you in the business community with this thought. We're here talking about the Asia-Pacific region, China specifically, but it all has to do with this vast Pacific Ocean that will occupy a good part of our thinking for the years to come. But I want you to remember this. The PIN code of the world today is 1114. This means that of the planet's 7 billion total inhabitants, maybe a little more, roughly 1 billion live in Europe, 1 billion are in the Americas, 1 billion are in Africa, and 4 billion live in Asia. By 2050, not so far out, folks. Asia will be up another 1 billion to 5 billion total, but then it will stop based on birth rates. And by then, Africa's population will have doubled from 1 billion to 2 billion. Europe and the Americas will stay roughly about the same. Now, by 2100, the world's PIN code will no longer be 1114, but 1145. The global population will reach a peak of about 11 billion people. 4 billion will be living in Africa. 5 billion will be living in Asia. By that time, the main maritime thoroughfare in the world will not be the Pacific. It will be the Indian Ocean, because that will be the waterway linking about 9 billion of the world's 11 billion inhabitants. So if you're looking for a good long-term investment, folks, might I recommend some good beachfront property in Sri Lanka Thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you.